In this video we will explore the history of the Mongol Empire. If you enjoy these videos, please feel free to leave a like and or subscribe. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Close your eyes and let your body settle. Feel the weight of your limbs sink gently downward. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw loosen. You have nowhere to be right now and nothing to do. For the next little while, you are simply going to listen as the story of one of history's greatest empires slowly unfolds around you. We are going to travel a very long way, across time and across the earth itself, to a land of open skies and endless grass, where the wind never seems to stop moving, and the stars at night hang so low they feel almost close enough to touch. This is the story of the Mongol Empire. The year is somewhere around 1150. Hold that number gently in your mind. 1150 years after the Common Era began. In the great continent of Asia, civilizations hum with ancient life. To the south and east, China is a world unto itself, vast, sophisticated, divided into competing dynasties, its cities filled with silk merchants and scholars and the smell of burning incense. To the west, the Islamic world stretches from Persia all the way to the edges of Europe, its libraries holding more knowledge than most people in the world could imagine. Kingdoms rise and fall like slow tides. Emperors grow old in their palaces. Priests pray in 100 different languages to 100 different heavens. And yet, in the north beyond the great mountain ranges and the dense forests, there's a place that most of those emperors never think about. A place that seems, from a distance, like it has very little at all. The Mongolian steppe. Picture it now, if you like. Let it build slowly in your mind. A plateau of grassland so wide that it takes weeks to cross on horseback. The sky above it is immense, perhaps the biggest sky you have ever seen in your imagination. Gray and silver in winter, a deep aching blue in summer. The grass ripples in every direction like the surface of a pale green sea. There are no cities here, no stone walls, no towers or temples rising above the horizon. Instead, there are camps, small clusters of round white tents called jazor, as they are sometimes known in the Western world, yurts. Each one is a careful construction, a lattice frame of bent wood, wrapped in thick felt made from the wool of sheep, with a small circular opening at the top to let the smoke from the fire rise out into the sky. Inside, everything is compact and purposeful. Blankets and furs for sleeping, hooks for hanging tools and weapons. A low fire in the center, coaxing warmth into the cold air. These are the homes of the nomadic peoples of the steppe, and everything about their way of life is shaped by movement. They follow the grass. As the seasons turn, the grass grows lush in one valley and fades in another, and so the families pack their zhuz, load their belongings onto horses and camels, and move. Always move. A family might travel hundreds of miles in a single year, following routes that their grandparents taught them, and their grandparents' grandparents before that. The horse is everything here. Children learn to ride before they can walk with confidence. By the time a boy or girl reaches the age of 5 or 6, they are already comfortable in the saddle. By adolescence, they can ride for an entire day without tiring, guiding their horse with subtle shifts of weight and knee, leaving their hands free. This will matter in the years to come, this freedom of the hands, because the steppe peoples are also, by necessity, hunters. And hunters who ride need to shoot. The Mongolian composite bow is a masterwork of patient engineering. Made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, each one shaped and dried and fitted over the course of months or even years, it is shorter than the longbows of Europe but far more powerful for its size. A trained archer on horseback can loose an arrow with devastating accuracy, not just standing still, but at full gallop, twisting in the saddle to fire in any direction, including directly behind them. This technique, firing backward while retreating at speed, will one day terrify armies from China to Hungary. But for now, it is simply how you feed your family. Life on the steppe is not easy. Winters are ferocious. Temperatures plunge so low that animals freeze where they stand. Blizzards can last for days. A family that has not prepared enough dried meat and stored enough fuel will not survive until spring. The margin between life and death is narrow, and everyone understands this. And yet there is beauty in it, too. Summer nights on the open steppe are extraordinary. The air is clean and cool, scented with grass and the smoke of distant fires. The Milky Way arches overhead in full, unobstructed glory, a river of soft white light that pours from one edge of the horizon to the other. Sitting outside a GER on such a night, with the sound of horses moving quietly nearby and the distant yipping of foxes in the dark, it is possible to feel very small and very peaceful, and very much a part of something ancient and ongoing. The Mongol peoples will carry this relationship with the sky with them always. They call the sky Tungri, the eternal blue heaven. It is not exactly a god, in the way that other cultures mean when they say the word. It is more like a vast presence, a source of power and fate. When great things happen, great victories, great catastrophes, they are felt to be the will of Tungri, moving through the world. But the steppe in 1150 is not a peaceful place between its people. The nomadic tribes of Mongolia are many, and they are fragmented. There are the Mongols themselves, but when we say Mongols at this time, we mean a loose collection of clans, not a unified nation. There are also the Tatars, the Merkits, the Naimans, the Karaits, the Yugas, and many others. These groups trade with one another, raid one another, intermarry, form alliances, break them, and feud across generations. The feuds are old. Some stretch back so far that no one can quite remember what started them. A raid on a herd of horses. A bride taken without proper negotiation. A man killed in a dispute over pasture. Each wound creates a debt, and debts on the steppe are not forgotten. They are carried forward in the memory of clans, nursed through the long winters, and eventually answered. It is into this world fractured, fierce, breathtakingly alive that a child will be born, sometime around the year 1162. His name, at birth, is Temujin. You may already know the name he will later be given, but that comes later. For now, he is simply a boy born in a difficult season, to a father named Yesige, a minor chief of a small Mongol clan called the Borjigin. According to the great chronicle known as the Secret History of the Mongols, one of the oldest and most extraordinary documents in all of Central Asian history, the infant Temujin was born gripping a blood clot in his right fist, the size of a knuckle bone. Those who knew the old signs said this meant he was destined to be a warrior. They were not wrong. Let that image rest with you for a moment. A child, born under a vast sky, gripping something tightly in his small hand, as if even in the very first moments of his life he was unwilling to let go. Outside the GER, the steppe stretches in every direction. The wind moves through the grass. The horses stand together for warmth. The stars wheel slowly overhead. The world in 1162 has no idea what is coming. The great cities of China do not know. The caliphs in their palaces do not know. The knights of Europe, the merchants of Persia, the farmers of Hungary and Poland and Russia, none of them know. The future is still folded up, quietly, inside a sleeping child on the edge of a vast and windy plateau. Temujin's father, Yesige, was a man of some standing, not powerful, but respected. He led a small band of the Borjigin clan, and he was known as a capable raider and a cunning negotiator. Like all steppe leaders, his authority rested not on land or titles, but on reputation, loyalty, and the number of fighters willing to follow him. When Temujin was around 9 years old, Yesugei decided it was time to find his son a bride. This was not unusual. On the steppe, alliances between clans were often sealed through marriage, and the arrangements were made early. Yesugei set out with his young son on horseback, traveling east toward the territory of the Kongarad people, a tribe known, it was said, for the beauty of their daughters and the wisdom of keeping peace through matrimony rather than war. Along the way, they stopped at a camp, and there Yesugei saw a girl named Bort. She was perhaps 9 or 10 years old, dark-eyed, calm, with a quality about her that the old sources describe with a word that might be translated as presence. Yesugei liked what he saw. The girl's father, a man named Dei Sekhen, seemed to approve of young Temujin as well, and so the agreement was made. Temujin would stay and live with Bort's family for a time, as was the custom, working and learning and growing before the marriage would be formalized. Yesugei said farewell to his son and turned his horse for home. He never arrived. On the journey back, Yesugei stopped at a camp of Tatar tribesmen to share a meal of basic courtesy of steppe hospitality. The Tatars recognized him. They had old grievances with his clan, old scars kept carefully in memory. And so, while offering the outward performance of welcome, they slipped poison into his food. By the time Yesugei reached his own camp, he was already dying. He managed to send word for Temujin to be brought home. But the boy arrived to find his father gone. Temujin was 9, perhaps 10 years old, and he was now the nominal head of a clan. What happened next reveals something essential about the world Temujin had been born into. Without Yesugei's strength and reputation to hold them together, the men and families who had followed him began to leave. One by one, they packed their gears and moved away to join stronger leaders. The logic was cold but clear. Loyalty on the steppe followed power, and power required a protector. A child could not protect anyone. Temujin's mother, a remarkable woman named Hoelin, pleaded with them to stay. She stood at the edge of the camp with a banner, the symbolic totem of clan identity, and waved it, calling out to the departing riders. They did not turn back. Hoelin was left with her children, Temujin and his brothers Kasa, Kujian, and Temuj, and a half-brother named Belgute. There was also a young girl, Temulin. The oldest among them was barely old enough to draw a bow with any force. They survived that first winter by foraging, by fishing in streams with improvised hooks made from bone, by digging for roots and picking berries and hunting the small animals that lived close to the ground. Hoelin, by all accounts, was fierce in her devotion to keeping her children alive, resourceful, tireless, and utterly unwilling to give in to despair. Let her sit in your mind for a moment. A woman alone on the steppe, in winter, feeding 6 children on almost nothing. She is not a figure who appears often in the grand sweep of conquest history. But without her, there is no Genghis Khan. There is no empire. There is simply a boy who starved. The years that followed were marked by hardship, and one particular darkness that Temujin would carry with him for the rest of his life. As the boys grew and began to hunt more effectively, the fragile household started to stabilize. But tension simmered between Temujin and his half-brother Belgute, and more sharply, between Temujin and another boy in the camp, a slightly older companion named Begtur, who asserted authority over the scarce food. The details are preserved in the secret history with an honesty that is almost uncomfortable. Temujin and his brother Kasa grew to resent Begtur deeply. One day, they found him sitting alone on a hillside. They approached from 2 sides, and they killed him. Their mother was furious. She called them wild animals. She compared them to dogs eating their own pack. Temujin, the chronicles say, was silent. What it meant, whether it was survival or cruelty, or simply the logic of scarcity pressed to its conclusion, is something historians have debated ever since. But it is there in the record. The man who would one day build the largest empire in history had blood on his hands before he had his full height. The darker trial came a few years later. Temujin was perhaps 14 or 15 when members of his father's old tribe, the Tai-Chiud, came to the camp and seized him. Why? Partly because a grown Temujin would become a rival. Partly because on the steppe, the son of a leader killed by your enemies is himself a future enemy, if he lives long enough. Better to neutralize the threat early. They fitted him with a kang, a heavy wooden collar and board, the kind used to restrain prisoners, keeping the arms spread and the head bowed. They took him to their main camp and kept him as a captive, passing him from GER to GER among different families to prevent him from forming connections or planning escape. Imagine being young, collared, humiliated, dragged from family to family among people who see you as a nuisance to be managed rather than a human being to be respected. And yet, there is a story again from the secret history of a night when a great celebration was underway in the Tai-Chiud camp, and the god assigned to watch Temujin fell asleep. Temujin saw his moment. He swung the kang as a weapon, struck the god, and ran into the darkness. He hid in a river submerged up to his neck in the cold current, only his face above the surface, watching the torches sweep the banks as the Tai-Chiud searched for him. A man from a different family, a man named Solkanshura, who had treated Temujin with small kindnesses during his captivity, found him. He looked at the boy in the river. He looked at the torches in the distance. And he told the other searchers that Temujin was not there. Later that night, Solkanshura sheltered the fugitive, hid him under wool in his cot, fed him, removed the kang, and sent him on his way with a horse. This small act of mercy, one man choosing to protect a desperate boy when it would have been easier and safer not to, is the kind of moment that history rarely pauses to honor. But Temujin did not forget it. He never forgot kindness, and he never forgot a wound. Both qualities would shape everything that followed. He made it back to his mother. He was still young, still poor, still leading a household with no warriors, no herd worth speaking of, and no real standing among the clans. But he was alive, and he was free, and something had settled in him during those years of hardship that was very difficult to name. Call it clarity, perhaps, or resolve, a kind of cold, patient understanding of the world and what it required. He was beginning to think about alliance. About loyalty, not the brittle, conditional loyalty that had evaporated when his father died, but something deeper, something that could be built deliberately and maintained. There was Bort, still waiting, or so he hoped, among the Kongarad. He had not seen her since childhood. There was an old friend of his father's, a powerful Karait chief named Torul, who owed Yesige a debt of gratitude for help received long ago. And there was a boy his own age, a companion from his earliest years, a boy named Jamuka, with whom Temujin had exchanged sacred tokens of friendship as a child. The two had sworn brotherhood. On the steppe, sworn brotherhood was among the most solemn bonds a person could make. It meant loyalty deeper than clan. These three threads, a wife, a powerful patron, and a sworn brother, would be the first ropes Temujin pulled on as he began, slowly and deliberately, to build a world. But all of that is still ahead. For now, let the story pause here, in the quiet aftermath of a young man's escape. He is riding through dark steppe grassland on a borrowed horse. Behind him, the fires of the Tai-Chiud camp are growing small. Ahead, the darkness is total and wide. The stars are out. Tungri, the eternal blue heaven, arches overhead in all its cold and wordless vastness. Perhaps he looks up. Perhaps he feels, as the chronicles will later suggest he always felt, that the sky is watching. That there is something in the movement of the world that has a direction to it. He is not yet great. He is not yet feared. He is simply a young man in the dark, breathing cold air, moving forward. Let that image carry you gently. The grass, the dark, the stars, the sound of hooves on soft earth, growing quieter and quieter until there's only the wind. The first thing Temujin did, when he had some stability, was go and collect his bride. Bort was still with her family among the Kongarad, still waiting, as it turned out, as the agreement their fathers had made held across the years of chaos. She was now perhaps 16 or 17. Temujin arrived, and the marriage was completed. It is worth pausing here, because Bort is not a minor figure in this story. She will become, over the decades that follow, one of Temujin's most trusted advisors. There are accounts of her counsel changing the course of his decisions, moments when she spoke plainly about loyalty or strategy, and he listened. On the steppe, women of high standing held real influence within the domestic and political sphere of the clan, and Bort wielded Hayes with intelligence and steadiness. She brought with her a wedding gift from her family, a coat of black sable fur. Rich, warm, and valuable. Temujin took that coat and rode to find Torul. Torul was the Khan of the Karates, one of the larger and more powerful confederations of the central steppe. He was older, experienced, and he owed a debt to the memory of Yesige, who had once helped restore him to his throne during a period of internal struggle. Temujin arrived at Torul's camp and presented the sable coat as a gift. It was a gesture laden with meaning, offering something of genuine worth to establish the relationship on a note of generosity and respect. Torul accepted. He agreed to take Temujin under his wing as a kind of junior ally, a vassal in the loose sense that the steppe understood the word. He would offer support and protection. In return, Temujin would fight alongside him when called upon. It was a modest beginning, but it was a foundation. Then came the crisis that would first show the world what Temujin was capable of. Not long after the marriage, a raiding party from the Merkit tribe swept through Temujin's camp in the night. The Merkits had old business with his family specifically, a grievance stretching back to how Yesige had once claimed Hoilan as a bride by taking her from a Merkit man. Blood debts on the steppe run long. Now they had come to collect. In the chaos and darkness of the raid, Temujin escaped on horseback, but Bort did not. She was taken. She was gone for months. Perhaps 8 months. Perhaps a little longer. The chronicles are not precise. During that time, she was held among the Merkits, given to one of their men as a kind of living retribution for what Yesige had done a generation before. When Bort was eventually rescued in a night raid that Temujin organized with Torul and Jamuka, his sworn brother, she was pregnant. The child, a boy, was born shortly afterward. His name was Jochi, which means, roughly, the guessed a name that carried within it an unspoken question about his parentage that would haunt him his entire life and create a fracture in the family that would never fully close. Temujin raised Jochi as his son without public hesitation. Whatever he felt privately, he kept it there. This is one of the qualities that the historical sources, even the hostile ones, tend to agree on. Temujin had an extraordinary capacity for composure, for setting aside what he felt in order to do what was necessary. It was not coldness, exactly. It was more like the kind of patience that comes from having learned, very young, that the world does not reward those who act from feeling alone. The rescue of Bort deepened his alliance with both Torul and Jamuka. For a time, Temujin and Jamuka lived and traveled together, two sworn brothers, pooling their followers, sharing their camps. It was during this period that people began to notice something about the way Temujin led. Most steppe leaders organized their followers along traditional lines, by clan, by family, by birth. You rose to prominence because of who your father was. The hierarchy was inherited and largely fixed. Temujin was doing something different. He was promoting people based on what they could do. A skilled tracker who was lowborn found himself with real responsibilities. A loyal soldier who had shown courage in a skirmish was rewarded and remembered. Temujin had experienced, firsthand, the unreliability of clan-based loyalty. He had watched it evaporate the day his father died. He seemed to have concluded that a different kind of loyalty was possible. One based on demonstrated trust, shared hardship, and the reliable exchange of reward for service. This sounds, perhaps, like a modest administrative insight. But on the steppe in the late 12th century, it was radical. And it worked. Fighters who had served lesser leaders began to drift toward Temujin's camp. His following grew. Inevitably, the partnership with Jamuka frayed. The exact cause is uncertain. The chronicles are colored by later politics, by the need to cast Temujin as a rightful leader and Jamuka as his foil. But the outlines are clear enough. After roughly a year and a half of traveling together, one morning the camp simply split. Some followers chose to stay with Jamuka and continue in one direction. Others chose to follow Temujin, who turned his column the other way. Jamuka was charismatic, intelligent, and brave. He was also, by most accounts, more traditional in his approach, more interested in maintaining the old hierarchies, more comfortable with the existing order of things. His followers were, in many cases, the better born. Temujin's followers were often the ones who had less to lose and more to gain from a new kind of arrangement. Both men knew, from this day forward, that their paths were diverging. And on the steppe, diverging paths eventually converge again at the point of a spear. Over the next several years, Temujin's reputation and following continued to grow. He fought. He won, and occasionally he lost. He built relationships with the leaders of smaller clans, offering protection and fair treatment in exchange for loyalty. He was careful about who he trusted and generous to those who had earned it. When enemies surrendered and offered their service genuinely, he often accepted them, absorbing their fighters and their knowledge rather than destroying them. When people betrayed him, the reckoning was absolute. The steppe was watching. In 1186 or thereabouts, the dates in early Mongol history are often approximate, a gathering of clan leaders, a kurultai, was called. And at that gathering, Temujin was named Khan. Not yet the Great Khan, not yet the ruler of all the steppe, but a Khan, a leader, a man recognized by a coalition of clans as the one they would follow. He was in his mid-20s. Jamuka's response was swift. He assembled a coalition of his own tribes who feared what Temujin's growing power meant for the old order and marched against him. The battle that followed was one of Temujin's clearest early defeats. He was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, and his forces were pushed back. It was not a catastrophe, but it was a setback, and it would have ended a lesser man's ambitions. Jamuka, after the victory, made a decision that revealed the difference between the two men as plainly as anything could. He had prisoners, men from Temujin's forces who had been captured in the battle, and he had them executed not quickly, but by boiling them alive in cauldrons. Then he had the heads of their commanders tied to the tails of his horses and dragged through the camp. The intention was terror. The message was, this is what happens to those who challenge the established order. The actual effect was the opposite of what he intended. Across the steppe, people who heard the story recoiled. This was cruelty beyond what the codes of steppe warfare typically sanctioned, even in a brutal world. And it made Temujin the defeated one appear, by comparison, as the more honorable man. Followers continued to come. Let the story rest here, in the slow accumulation of these years. There is something quietly compelling about this phase of Temujin's life before the great conquests, before the title that would make his name permanent in the memory of the world. It is a period of learning, of patience, of building something durable out of materials that most people would have looked at and seen only wreckage. a boy raised in poverty, a captive who escaped, a husband who lost his wife and took her back, a man who looked at the way his world was organized and decided, without fanfare, to organize his own corner of it differently. None of this was destiny, exactly. It was work, careful, attentive, often painful work. Outside, the steppe continues its ancient business. The grass moves. The horses breathe. The stars do what they have always done, turning slowly above everything, indifferent and magnificent. Breathe with them for a moment. In and out. The night is long, and the story has many miles still to go. By the early years of the 13th century, Temujin had been fighting, negotiating, and building for nearly 2 decades. The steppe was not yet unified. There were still powerful rivals. Jamuka remained active, assembling coalitions, pressing at the edges of Temujin's growing confederation. The Naimans, in the west of the Mongolian plateau, were strong and proud and deeply hostile. The Tatars, the tribe who had poisoned his father, still needed to be reckoned with. And Temujin reckoned with them. The campaign against the Tatars was conducted with a thoroughness that was characteristic of the man. When the fighting was over, he gathered his commanders and issued a directive that must have seemed extraordinary even to those who carried it out. He ordered that every Tatar man taller than the linchpin of a wagon wield the axle pin, roughly the height of a young child, was to be killed. Women and children would be absorbed into the Mongol clans as servants and eventual members. It was a complete erasure of the Tatar warrior class. Brutal, yes. Calculated, certainly. And deeply personal, these were the people who had killed his father with a poisoned meal and set every hardship of his early life in motion. He also took 2 Tatar women as wives, Yesige and Tsulan. The absorption of enemy nobility into his own household was another characteristic move, transforming potential sources of future vengeance into ties of loyalty and kinship. The Naimans fell next, after a campaign in which Temujin's forces demonstrated for the first time the full, terrifying coordination of the army he had been quietly assembling. And then there was Jamuka, the last great rival, the sworn brother. After years of opposition, Jamuka found himself abandoned by his remaining followers. Some came over to Temujin voluntarily. Others were captured in the field. In the end, Jamuka was brought before Temujin by a small group of men who had seized him hoping to win favor. Temujin looked at the men who had betrayed their own leader to save themselves. And he had them executed. Every one of them. The reasoning, as the chronicles preserve it, was clear. A man who betrays his master cannot be trusted by any master. Loyalty, the thing Temujin had spent his entire adult life trying to build, refine, and make durable, was not something he would reward its opposite of, regardless of how convenient the outcome. Then he turned to Jamuka. The 2 men faced each other, old companions, old enemies, former sworn brothers who had spent years trying to destroy one another. What passed between them, the chronicles record with a kind of restrained dignity. Temujin offered reconciliation. He offered to restore the brotherhood they had sworn as boys. Jamuka declined. He said, in effect, that there was only room for one sun in the sky, that the steppe could not hold both of them. And he asked for a noble death, a death without the shedding of blood, as was the custom for those of high standing. Temujin granted it. Jamuka was executed by having his back broken, a death considered honorable, keeping his blood within his body, sending his spirit intact to whatever came after. It is a strange and melancholy scene. 2 boys who had once given each other gifts and sworn eternal brotherhood, meeting at the end of a long contest, and parting finally and completely. The chronicles seem to feel the weight of it. Even in victory, there is something elegiac in the air. The steppe was unified. For the first time in living memory, perhaps for the first time ever, Depending on how you measure such things, the fractious, feuding tribes of the Mongolian plateau were under the authority of a single leader. The clans that had raided each other for generations, carried grudges across decades, fought and bled over pasture and horses and brides. They were, at least for now, one. A Kurultai was called. A great assembly. Imagine it, if you can. The year is 1206. It is spring, the grass is green, and the rivers are running with snowmelt from the mountains. On the banks of the Onan River, in the heartland of Mongolia, the leaders of every major clan and tribe have gathered. Hundreds of white jars spread across the valley. Thousands of horses. The smell of cook fires and leather, and the sharp clean scent of the steppe after rain. Standards and banners are planted in the earth. The white banner with 9 tails of white horsehair, the symbol of the Mongol nation in peacetime, flies above the assembly. And in the center of it all, Temujin sits. A shaman, a holy man named Teb-Tumri, known as the one who communed directly with the eternal blue heaven, rose and addressed the gathering. He declared that Tumri had spoken, that the sky itself had chosen this man, that it was the will of heaven that he rule not just the Mongols, but all people under the great sky. The assembly acclaimed him. He was given a new name, a title, Genghis Khan. The precise meaning of Genghis has been debated by scholars for centuries. The most widely accepted interpretation is something like universal or oceanic, vast, without boundary, encompassing everything. Combined with the Khan ruler, Lord, it becomes something like the ruler of all, the universal king. He was somewhere in his 40s. He had been building toward this moment for most of his adult life, through hardship and loss and patient, deliberate work. And now the work had a name. But here is the thing about Genghis Khan that separates the historical man from the monster of popular imagination. He did not stop building. Where another leader might have consolidated, rested, enjoyed the fruits of power, Genghis Khan immediately set about transforming the confederation he had won into something more durable, more sophisticated, and more capable than anything the steppe had ever produced. He reorganized the entire army along decimal lines, units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. Each unit had a clear commander. Each commander was accountable to the one above. The old clan structures were deliberately broken up and redistributed across these new units, so that a man's loyalty was to his unit and his commander to the structure Genghis had built rather than to his birth clan. He created a personal guard, the Keshig, an elite corps of 10,000 men drawn from the best fighters across all the tribes. Entry into the Keshig was a mark of the highest honor, and the sons of commanders across the empire served in it, which also functioned as a subtle but effective system of keeping loyalty. If your son serves the Khan directly, you think twice before betraying him. He established a law code, the Yasa, a body of decrees covering everything from the treatment of prisoners to the protocol of the hunt to the rules of trade and diplomacy. Some of its provisions were harsh by any standard. Others were, for the era, surprisingly progressive. Religious tolerance was explicitly enshrined, meaning that Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and shamans all fell under the same protection. Merchants and envoys received guaranteed safe passage. The message the Yasa sent was consistent. Within the order Genghis had created, there were rules, and the rules applied to everyone, including, at least in principle, the Khan himself. There is something almost paradoxical about this. A man who achieved power through extraordinary violence, then spent enormous energy creating the architecture of a functioning state. But perhaps it is not so paradoxical. Perhaps it is exactly what you would expect from someone who had spent his childhood watching what happened when systems failed, when loyalty evaporated, when there were no rules that held. He had lived in the gap between order and chaos. He knew what that gap cost. And so he built walls against it. Let the assembly on the Onon River linger in your imagination for a moment. The banners, the gathered leaders, the spring grass. A man in his 40s, weathered by decades of hardship and campaigning, sitting at the center of something he had built from almost nothing. He does not look, perhaps, the way we might expect a world conqueror to look. The portraits that survive are from after his death, reconstructed by artists who never saw him. What we know from written descriptions is that he was tall, with a broad face and, reportedly, green or gray-green eyes unusual for a Mongolian, and noted with some wonder by those who encountered him. But what strikes almost every account of those who met him, friend and enemy alike, is something harder to capture in a portrait. A quality of complete attention, of a man who, when he looked at you, was entirely present, entirely focused, as if every conversation, every decision, every moment had his full and undivided weight behind it. That quality, more than any sword or horse, may be the most fearsome thing about him. Outside, the Onon River moves quietly over its stones. The banners stir in the spring wind. The assembled clans are feasting, and the sound of it carries across the valley laughter, music, the low rumble of thousands of voices. The empire is one day old. It is also, in a sense, already ancient, built on decades of labor, loss, patience, and something very close to vision. To understand what the Mongol army was, it helps to first understand what it was not. It was not, in the beginning, a professional standing army in the way that Rome or China maintained one. There were no barracks, no parade grounds, no permanent garrison stationed across a controlled territory. The Mongol warrior was, first and foremost, a nomad. He lived on the steppe, raised his family, tended his animals, and was also from boyhood a rider, a hunter, and an archer of exceptional skill. What Genghis Khan did was take this population of highly capable individuals and impose upon them a structure of breathtaking precision. The decimal system he introduced after 1206 was the skeleton of everything. 10 men formed an Arban squad, led by the most capable among them, chosen by the group rather than assigned by birth. 10 Arbans formed a Zuun, a company of 100. 10 Zuuns formed a Minghan, a regiment of 1,000. And 10 Minghans formed a Tumen 10,000 men, the great operational unit of the Mongol army, roughly equivalent to a modern division. Every man knew his place in this structure. Every man knew his commander, and his commander's commander. The chain of communication and authority ran all the way from the single rider to the Khan himself, and it ran fast, far faster than any comparable army of the era. Speed was perhaps the most important word in the Mongol military vocabulary. An army that moves slowly gives its enemy time. Time to prepare defenses. Time to call for allies. Time to move supplies, fortify walls, dig ditches. Speed denies all of that. Speed turns the advantage of the defender knowing their own territory, having walls and stores and preparation into something much less useful. A Mongol Tumen on campaign moved at a pace that contemporary observers described with barely concealed disbelief. Each warrior traveled with a string of horses, typically 3 to 5 animals per man, sometimes more. When one horse was tired, the riders simply changed mounts. The army ate from their herds as they moved, supplemented by hunting and foraging. They carried dried meat and a fermented mare's milk called irag that provided sustenance without requiring cooking. They needed very little that they could not carry with them or find along the way. The result was an army that could cover ground vast, seemingly impossible ground in a fraction of the time that sedentary armies could manage. Campaigns that enemies calculated would give them weeks of preparation time instead gave them days or hours. But speed alone does not explain the Mongol victories against fortified cities, of which there would be many. The steppe warrior, by tradition, was not a siege specialist. Walls and towers and defended gates were the tools of a different kind of warfare, the warfare of settled peoples, of farmers and merchants who built things and then defended them. How does a horse archer take a stone fortress? Genghis Khan's answer to this question was characteristically direct. He found people who knew how, and he recruited them. After early campaigns in northern China against the Jurchen dynasty, which we will follow more closely in the next segment, the Mongols acquired Chinese engineers. Men who understood the mathematics of trajectory, the construction of catapults and trebuchets, the art of undermining walls and redirecting rivers. These engineers became part of the army. They traveled with the tumans, and their machines traveled with them, broken down into components on carts and reassembled when needed. Later, Persian engineers added further expertise. Then others still, as the empire grew and absorbed the technical knowledge of each civilization it encountered. The Mongol army became, over time, a rolling repository of the military technology of the known world. There was also the matter of intelligence. Before any major campaign, Genghis Khan sent out networks of scouts and spies. Merchants who traded along the intended routes were questioned. Defectors and travelers were interviewed. Maps were drawn, as good as the era permitted. The commanders who would lead the campaign studied everything available before a single tumen moved. When the army did move, it often divided into multiple columns, spreading across a front, so wide that the enemy could not concentrate their forces against any single point. The columns would converge on a target from different directions simultaneously, or one column would drive the enemy toward another, like animals being herded into a pen. This strategy, the Naj, named after the great Mongol hunting drive in which thousands of riders formed a vast circle and slowly contracted it, trapping everything within, was the template for campaign after campaign. What worked for hunting deer and wolves on the steppe turned out to work equally well for hunting armies. And then there was the psychological dimension, which deserves its own quiet moment of consideration. The Mongols understood, with great sophistication, that terror was a force multiplier. Before arriving at a city, they would often send messengers ahead with a simple, stark message: surrender, and you will be spared. Your merchants will be protected. Your religious leaders will be left unmolested. Your craftsmen and scholars and administrators will be welcomed into the empire and put to work. Life will continue. Resistance, however, will be answered completely. Many cities surrendered. The ones that did were, generally, treated according to the terms offered. The Mongols were not, as is sometimes assumed, simply destroyers. They had a genuine interest in absorbing functioning economies and skilled populations. A living, productive city paid tribute. A rubble field paid nothing. But the cities that resisted, and some did, bravely and stubbornly faced something else entirely. The chronicles from these places, written by survivors and those who came after, describe scenes of almost incomprehensible devastation. Not because the Mongols enjoyed destruction for its own sake, but because the message had to be credible. If resistance was sometimes rewarded with mercy, the threat lost its force. And so the logic of the system required that resistance, when it occurred, was answered without restraint. It is one of the darkest aspects of this history, and it sits alongside the administrative genius and the cultural tolerance without resolving anything comfortable. The men who served in this army were not, individually, unusual in the way that the system they served in was unusual. They were young men, mostly. Many had grown up in poverty, on a landscape that offered hardship as its default condition. They rode because they had always ridden. They shot because they had always shot. They endured cold and hunger and exhaustion because the steppe had been teaching those lessons since before they were born. What the army gave them, in addition to structure and purpose, was something that the old clan system had never reliably provided: the possibility of genuine advancement. Promotion in Genghis Khan's army was merit-based, to a degree extraordinary for the era. A man who showed courage, skill, and loyalty could rise. The commanders who would lead the great campaigns, men like Jebe, Subutai, Mukali, were not all highborn. Several came from obscurity. 1. Subutai was the son of a blacksmith. Subutai would go on to become perhaps the greatest military strategist of the medieval world. He campaigned across distances that beggar the imagination, from Mongolia to Hungary, from the frozen north to the Persian Gulf, winning battle after battle against opponents who had more men, more resources, and the advantage of defending their home ground. He was loyal to the Khan with the loyalty of a man who knew exactly what he had been given, and by whom. Let all of this settle in your mind gently. You do not need to remember the names of the units, or the details of the siege equipment, or the precise mechanics of the encirclement tactics. Just let the shape of it rest there, like the outline of a mountain seen from a distance. Something vast was assembled on the Mongolian plateau in the first years of the 13th century. Something that combined speed and coordination and intelligence and psychological acuity in a way the world had not seen before and would not quite see again. And it was about to move. To the south and east, the great walled cities of northern China glimmered in the distance, ancient and wealthy, and defended by some of the most formidable fortifications human beings had yet constructed. Genghis Khan looked at them. He had spent his whole life learning to see problems clearly and then solving them. The walls did not discourage him. Outside, the night deepens. The camp is quiet. The fires have burned down to low orange coals. The horses stand together in the dark, their breath rising in small clouds. Somewhere, a man on watch sits with his back to a GER and his eyes on the horizon, and the horizon is empty and still. The army sleeps, and in the morning it will move. Breathe slowly. Let the darkness be comfortable around you. The story continues on the other side of sleep. The army has risen before dawn. The horses are saddled. The standards have been lifted from the earth and planted in their brackets. And now the great columns begin to move south and east, out of the Mongolian heartland, toward a horizon that trembles faintly with what is coming. To the south of Mongolia lay a world of extraordinary age and complexity. China in the early 13th century was not a single unified state, but a landscape of competing powers, each occupying a different piece of a vast territory. In the north, ruling from a great capital city called Zhonggyune, what is today Beijing, was the Jurchen Jin dynasty. The Jurchens were themselves a semi-nomadic people who had swept down from Manchuria a century earlier and conquered northern China from the previous ruling house. They had since settled into the patterns of Chinese imperial administration, building walls, collecting taxes, sponsoring scholarship, and looking down with considerable disdain at the nomads to their north. They had, in fact, been paying those nomads, the Mongols among them, to stay in their own territory. Subsidies and trade arrangements designed to keep the steppe people manageable. Genghis Khan had received these payments as a younger man. He knew exactly what they meant. They were not respect. They were the price of distance. He was no longer interested in distance. The campaigns against the Jin dynasty unfolded over more than 2 decades, from roughly 1211 to 1234, though Genghis Khan himself would not live to see their conclusion. They were not a single dramatic stroke, but a long, grinding, deeply complex series of operations across a landscape of walled cities, mountain passes, river crossings, and fortified lines. The Jin had walls, many walls. The most famous defensive barrier in the world is what we now call the Great Wall of China, though in this era it was a patchwork of older structures that ran along the northern frontier. Behind it lay layers of defended positions, garrison towns, rivers that served as natural moats. The Mongols went around, over, through, Jeeb, one of Genghis Khan's most gifted commanders, a man who had once shot the Khan's horse out from under him in battle and then, upon being captured, admitted to it without flinching, earning instant promotion, led a column through a pass the Jin considered impassable in winter. The garrison on the other side, confident in the season's protection, was overwhelmed before it could organize a defense. This pattern repeated itself across the campaign. The Mongols found the seam in every defense, the overlooked pass, the undermanned section of wall, the moment when a garrison's attention was drawn one way, while the real blow came from another. Zhongju itself, a city of perhaps 1 million people, one of the largest urban centers on earth at that time, fell in 1215. It did not fall quickly. The siege was long and costly. The Jin court evacuated south, retreating deeper into Chinese territory. When the city finally capitulated, it had been so long under siege that famine had hollowed it out from within. What happened after the fall is recorded by a Taoist monk named Qiu Chuji, who passed through the region a few years later on his way to meet Genghis Khan. He described the bones of the dead whitening across the plains around the city, the ruins still visible, the countryside emptied of its people. It is a sobering image to sit with. A city of 1 million souls, reduced to silence and bones within a few years. And yet, and this is the complicated truth of the Mongol conquests, Zhongju was not simply abandoned. It was rebuilt. Administrators were appointed. Trade resumed. The Mongols had no interest in ruling over permanent rubble. They wanted the tax revenues, the craftsmen, the scholars, the infrastructure. Destruction was the cost of resistance. Administration was the reward of submission. Both were real, and both happened. Among those who came to the attention of Genghis Khan during these years was a man named Yelu Chutsai. Yelu Chutsai was a Jurchen nobleman of Khitan descent, educated, deeply versed in Chinese classical learning, trained in astronomy and divination as well as administration. When Zhongju fell, he was taken into the Khan's service. The story of their first meeting has been preserved, and it carries a quality that seems almost too perfect, though the sources are generally considered reliable on this point. Genghis Khan looked at this learned man from the fallen enemy court and said something to the effect of, "The Jin are your enemies. I have avenged you." Yelu Chutsai replied, calmly, that his father and grandfather had served the Jin. He could not call his father's rulers his enemies. Genghis Khan, by all accounts, was delighted. Not offended, delighted. A man who would speak plainly to his face, who had the backbone to defend loyalty even in defeat, was exactly the kind of man he wanted near him. Yelu Chutsai served the Mongol court for decades. He argued, repeatedly and with considerable courage, against the more destructive impulses of the conquest, making the case, in purely practical terms, that living farmers and craftsmen produced more wealth than dead ones. He saved cities. He reformed tax policy. He was a civilizing voice within the machinery of war. He is not a name most people know, but the shape of the empire that emerged, the parts of it that functioned, that produced rather than only consumed, owes something real to him. While the campaigns in northern China ground forward, Genghis Khan himself did not remain stationary. There were operations against the Shishia, a Tangut kingdom occupying the territory roughly corresponding to today's Gansu and Ningxia provinces, that required his personal attention. There were administrative matters across the vast steppe homeland. There were his sons to manage, Jochi, Shagatai, Ojade, and Tului, each with their own temperaments and ambitions and rivalries, each needing to be positioned carefully within the structure of the empire to come. And then something happened to the west that drew his attention like a flame draws a moth. A wealthy, powerful empire called the Khwarezmian Shah ruled a swathe of territory stretching from Persia into Central Asia, modern-day Iran, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan. It controlled the Great Silk Road cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench, cities of gardens and libraries, of ceramic domes that caught the light, of bazaars where goods from China and the Mediterranean met and mingled. Genghis Khan had initially sought trade with this empire, not war. He sent a large caravan of several hundred merchants and envoys to the Khwarezmian city of Otrar as a gesture of commercial goodwill. The governor of Otrar had them all killed. He accused them of being spies. He may have been right about some of them. He was certainly motivated by greed. The caravan's goods were seized and distributed. But whatever his reasons, the act set in motion something that would reshape the Western world. Genghis Khan sent 3 ambassadors to the Khwarezmian Shah, demanding justice for the massacre. The Shah had one of the ambassadors executed and the others mutilated, their beards shaved off, a profound humiliation in the culture of the steppe, and sent back. The response to this took a moment to build. It is said that Genghis Khan went alone to a mountain and spent 3 days in prayer and fasting, communing with Tungri. What passed between a man and his heaven during those 3 days is not recorded. What emerged on the 4th day was a decision. The Khwarezmian Empire would be destroyed. Not raided. Not subdued. Destroyed. We will follow that campaign in the next segment, as it belongs there. But it is worth pausing here, at the edge of it, to feel the weight of the moment. An insult had been delivered. An act of contempt not just toward the merchants, but toward the idea that there was a new power in the world whose messengers deserved the basic protections of diplomatic custom. Genghis Khan had built, from nothing, a unified steppe nation and a military instrument of terrifying capability. He had reduced the Jin capital to ruins. He ruled more territory than any single person in the history of the world up to that point. And someone had shaved his ambassadors' beards and sent them home. The world, still, had not fully understood what had been built on the Mongolian plateau. It was about to. The Khwarezmian Empire, in the year 1219, was among the wealthiest and most powerful states in the world. Its ruler, Shah Muhammad II, controlled a territory of immense richness, the fertile valleys of Persia, the ancient cities of Transoxiana, the mountain passes of Afghanistan, the trade routes that connected China to the Mediterranean. His capital at Samarkand was one of the jewels of the medieval world, a city of blue-tiled mosques and madrasas, of mathematicians and poets, of gardens watered by intricate irrigation channels, of bazaars fragrant with spice and silk, and the particular smell of old books being sold in the open air. The Shah had an army of perhaps 400,000 men. He had walled cities, mountain fortresses, loyal generals. He believed, not without reason, that his empire was essentially impregnable. He was wrong, but the nature of his wrongness is instructive. Rather than concentrate his forces and meet the Mongols in the open field where the outcome might at least have been uncertain, the Shah chose to distribute his army across the garrisons of his many cities. His reasoning was that the cities were strong, and that the Mongols, as steppe nomads, would be unable to reduce them efficiently. He had not, apparently, received reliable reports about what had happened to Zhongdu. Genghis Khan crossed into Khwarezmian territory in the autumn of 1219 with a force estimated at somewhere between 100 and 200,000 men. The numbers in the sources vary, and the truth is probably unknowable. He divided this force into multiple columns, as was his method, each commanded by one of his most capable generals or sons. Jebe and Subutai swept north and west to seal off escape routes and cut the empire's connections to potential allies. Genghis Khan himself, with his son Tului, moved directly on the great cities of Transoxiana. The city of Otrar, where the merchants had been massacred, was besieged and eventually taken after a months-long resistance. Its governor, the man who had ordered the killing, was executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears. The chronicles record this without particular emphasis. It was understood as a proportionate answer. Then the columns converged on the heartland. Bukhara was one of the oldest and most celebrated cities in the Islamic world. Its scholars had made contributions to mathematics, medicine, and philosophy that had echoed through centuries. The great physician and philosopher Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, had been born near Bukhara 2 centuries earlier, and the city still carried the prestige of that intellectual tradition. When the Mongol army appeared before its walls in February of 1220, the garrison attempted a breakout and was annihilated in the open field. The city's leaders then opened the gates. Genghis Khan rode into Bukhara. He went, reportedly, to the Great Mosque, the most significant building in the city, and asked whether it was the palace of the Sultan. When told it was the house of God, he is said to have remarked that the hay was ripe for cutting, and ordered his horses brought in to be fed from grain stores in the mosque's courtyard. Whether this story is literally true or whether it accumulated symbolic meaning in the retelling, it captures something real about the encounter. A man from a world of open sky and felt tents, standing in the most sacred building of a sophisticated urban civilization, making no gesture of reverence, treating the most holy as simply the most useful. He then addressed the assembled population from the steps of the mosque. He told them that he was the punishment of God, that if they had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like him upon them. The city's population survived, largely. Its buildings were less fortunate. A fire, whether started deliberately or by accident, the sources disagree, consumed much of Bukhara. The walls were demolished. The great library, the scholars, the centuries of accumulated manuscripts, the fate of much of it is simply gone. Samarkand fell that same spring. It was larger, better defended, and more heavily garrisoned than Bukhara. Its walls were formidable. Its defenders numbered in the tens of thousands. And yet within days of the Mongol army's appearance, the city's Turkish garrison attempted a sortie, was cut apart in the field, and retreated back inside. Shortly afterward, the city's civilian leaders opened the gates, hoping for mercy. They received it, conditionally. Craftsmen and scholars were identified and sent east to Mongolia and China, where their skills were valued. The general population was ordered to leave the city temporarily, while it was processed and stripped of anything useful. Many were never allowed to return. The garrison troops who had surrendered were incorporated into the Mongol forces as a standard practice or executed if they were deemed unreliable. The Shah, Muhammad II, fled. He fled south, then west, then wherever the next report of approaching Mongol horsemen was not. Jebe and Subutai, those 2 extraordinary commanders, were sent specifically to hunt him. They pursued him across Persia, into the Caucasus, around the Caspian Sea. The Shah, one of the most powerful rulers on earth just months before, died alone on a small island in the Caspian Sea, reportedly lacking even a proper burial shroud. His empire was still being dismantled behind him. The campaign continued for 3 years, spreading across the entire Khwarezmian territory. City after city was approached with the offer, surrender and live, resist and be destroyed. Some surrendered. Some did not. The cities that resisted Urgench, Maiv, Nishapur, Herat were treated according to the logic of the system. The chronicles record population figures for these destructions that are almost certainly exaggerated by later horrified copyists. But the underlying reality is not in serious dispute: mass killing on a scale that depopulated entire regions for generations. Merv, which had been one of the great cities of the Silk Road for centuries, a place Marco Polo, traveling several decades later, would describe as having once been among the finest cities in the world, was systematically destroyed. The irrigation systems that had made its surrounding region fertile for millennia were wrecked. The land did not fully recover for centuries. This is the darkest chapter of the Mongol story, and it deserves to be named clearly even in a telling meant for rest. The destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire was among the largest human catastrophes of the medieval period. The material losses, the books, the buildings, the accumulated knowledge and art and infrastructure were irreplaceable. The human losses were staggering. And it happened, in the end, because a provincial governor killed some merchants and shaved the beards of ambassadors. The disproportionality is almost too large to hold in the mind. A series of bad decisions by men who could not see past the immediate, who did not understand the nature of what was gathering on their northern horizon, and the consequence was the unraveling of one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the medieval world. While the Western campaigns were still unfolding, Gebe and Subutai continued north and west on what became one of the most astonishing military expeditions in history. Freed from the main campaign after the Shah's death, the two generals led a force of perhaps 20,000 men on a reconnaissance sweep that took them around the Caspian Sea, through the Caucasus Mountains, into the North Caucasian steppe, and eventually into the territory of the Rus princes of what is now Ukraine and Russia. They defeated a combined Rus and Cuman force at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, the first time Mongol forces had ever met European armies in the field. The Rus princes were routed. Several were captured and executed in the Mongol fashion for nobility, placed under wooden boards and suffocated beneath the weight of the victorious generals feasting on top of them. No bloodshed. A death with, in the steppe understanding, a kind of terrible honor. Then Gebe and Subutai turned east and rode home. They had been gone for 3 years. They had covered perhaps 8,000 miles. They had defeated every army they encountered. They brought back maps, intelligence, and an understanding of the lands to the west that no Mongol commander had possessed before. Those maps would be used again, not many years hence. Genghis Khan returned from the Western campaign to Mongolia with the knowledge that the Khwarezmian Empire was broken, and with the further knowledge that his own body was no longer entirely reliable. He was in his 60s. He had spent 40 years in the saddle, in all weathers, in all seasons. The accumulated damage of that life was making itself felt. There was still the matter of the Shishia, the Tangut kingdom to the southwest of Mongolia, which had failed to provide troops for the Western campaign when called upon. This was, in Genghis Khan's accounting, a betrayal that required an answer. He must in the winter of 1225, Genghis Khan returned from the Western campaigns to his homeland on the Mongolian plateau. He was somewhere in his early 60s. The exact year of his birth is uncertain enough that historians cannot be precise. He had been campaigning almost continuously for the better part of 4 decades. The body that had ridden tens of thousands of miles, that had endured the cold of Mongolian winters and the heat of Chinese and Persian summers, that had survived wounds and fevers and the simple relentless grinding of a life spent outdoors in all weathers, that body was beginning to ask for things it had never asked for before. Rest, stillness, the warmth of a familiar fire. He is said to have spent time in these final years hunting the great ceremonial hunts of the steppe, the Nij, where thousands of riders formed a vast circle across the landscape and slowly contracted it over days or weeks, driving everything inward until the animals were concentrated in a single place. It was both a military exercise and a ritual pleasure, and Genghis Khan had loved it since boyhood. On one such hunt, his horse shied at something, a wild animal breaking unexpectedly from cover, and he was thrown. He was an old man by now, and the fall was hard. He recovered, or appeared to, but those around him noticed that something had changed. A vitality that had always seemed inexhaustible was quieter than before. But there was still the matter of the Shishia. The Tangut kingdom to the southwest had refused to send troops for the Western campaign, a direct refusal of the Khan's summons, which in the logic of the empire was an act of open defiance. Genghis Khan had been patient with them before, conducting punitive campaigns that ended in negotiated submission rather than total destruction. This time, he had decided patience was finished. In 1226, he led his army south into Shishia territory for the last time. The campaign was brutal and methodical. City after city fell. The Tangut ruler appealed for terms, then delayed, then negotiated again, perhaps hoping the old Khan's health would solve the problem for him. It did not solve it in time. The Shishia capital fell in 1227. Genghis Khan did not live to see it completed. He died in August of 1227, while the campaign was still in its final stages. The cause of his death is one of history's genuinely open questions. The most widely accepted explanation is that he never fully recovered from the fall from his horse the previous year, that an internal injury, or an illness that the fall had weakened him against, finally overcame him. Some later sources suggest a fever. A few propose more dramatic explanations that most historians discount. What is recorded, with consistency across multiple sources, is that he knew he was dying. He gathered his sons and closest commanders. He spoke to them about the empire he was leaving behind, its structure, its future, its vulnerabilities. He chose his son Ojide as his successor, though the formal confirmation would require a kurultai of all the Mongol nobility. He gave instructions for the campaign to continue and for the Shishia royal line to be extinguished entirely. And then, the chronicles tell us, he was gone. He was buried somewhere in the landscape of his homeland, exactly where has never been determined, and was perhaps never meant to be. According to tradition, the funeral cortege killed anyone who saw it pass, to preserve the secret of the burial site. After the interment, horses were driven back and forth across the ground until it was indistinguishable from the surrounding steppe. The land closed over him like water. The eternal blue heaven took back what it had, perhaps, always owned. Sit with that for a moment. A man who had conquered more of the earth's surface than anyone before him, whose name had caused the rulers of civilizations on 3 continents to wake in the night with their hearts beating fast, buried in an unmarked place in the grass of the steppe he had been born on. No pyramid, no great mausoleum, no monument, just the wind and the grass moving in it, and the sky above everything. There is something almost peaceful in that image, if you let it be. The empire did not die with him. If anything, it expanded. Ojide Khan, confirmed at a great kurultai in 1229, proved to be a capable of very different ruler from his father. Where Genghis had been disciplined, Ojide was generous to a fault, famously, almost compulsively hospitable, a man who would give away things he could not afford to give and who drank with an enthusiasm that eventually killed him. But he was also politically astute enough to hold the empire together through its most dangerous transition, and he had the wisdom to trust the extraordinary commanders his father had trained. Under Ojide, the campaigns continued in every direction. In China, the Jin dynasty, still holding out in its southern territories, was finally extinguished in 1234. The conquest his father had begun 20 years earlier was complete. In Korea, Mongol armies pushed the peninsula's rulers to a small island off the coast, where they held out for decades in a grim, expensive stalemate. In Persia and the Middle East, Mongol forces pressed further into territories that would eventually bring them to the borders of Egypt, and to the west, following those maps that Jebe and Subutai had brought back from their great ride. The Tumans turned toward Europe. The Western campaign of 1236 to 1242 was commanded by a prince named Batu, grandson of Genghis Khan, with Subutai now in his 60s and traveling in a cart because his body could no longer easily bear a horse, but still the sharpest military mind in the world as his chief strategist. They swept through the Volga Bulgars. They shattered the Cumans of the southern steppe. They descended on the Rus principalities in the winter of 1237, when the frozen rivers became highways for cavalry, and the cities of Vladimir and Suzdal and Ryazan and a dozen others were reduced to ash and silence. Kiev, one of the great cities of medieval Europe, a place of golden-domed churches and thriving commerce, fell in December of 1240. A Franciscan friar named Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, who passed through the region a few years later on a diplomatic mission to the Mongol court, described the landscape around Kiev as covered with the skulls and bones of the dead, lying in such numbers across the fields that they were impossible to count. Then the army entered Poland and Hungary. In the spring of 1241, at the Battle of Legnica in Poland, a combined force of Polish and German knights was annihilated. On roughly the same day, to the south, Subutai's main force destroyed the Hungarian royal army at the Battle of Mohi. King Bela IV of Hungary fled. The Mongol advance guards reached the shores of the Adriatic Sea. Western Europe, France, the Holy Roman Empire, the Papal States lay open. There was nothing between the Mongol army and the Atlantic Ocean that could have stopped it. And then, in the spring of 1242, the army stopped and turned around. Why? It is one of history's most debated questions. The news had arrived that Genghis Khan had died suddenly of drink in December of 1241. By Mongol law and custom, the senior princes were required to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai that would choose the next great Khan. Batu, as a grandson of Genghis, had to be there. Whether the army would have continued west if Ojide had lived is unknowable. Some historians argue that the horses were exhausted, that the supply lines were stretched to breaking, that the army could not have sustained itself much further into the dense forests and fragmented kingdoms of Western Europe. Others point to Subutai's meticulous planning and the army's demonstrated capacity for the seemingly impossible, and suggest that the only thing that saved Paris and Rome was the death of a man in Mongolia from too much wine. Europe never knew, in the moment, how close it had come. The chronicles show bewilderment that the army had arrived like a force of nature and then, inexplicably, retreated. Some said it was the intercession of God. Some said the Mongols had simply lost interest. The true reason was a succession crisis thousands of miles to the east. The decades after Ojide's death were marked by exactly the kind of internal struggle that Genghis Khan had spent his life trying to prevent. The princes of his four great family lines, the descendants of Jochi, Chagatai, Ojide, and Tolui, competed for supremacy. Regents governed in the gaps between great Khans. A capable woman named Torajin, Ojide's widow, held the empire together through sheer force of will for 5 years while the succession was disputed. Her son Gyayak was eventually confirmed as Great Khan, but died after only 2 years. Eventually, through a decisive shift in the internal politics of the Mongol court, the line of Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest son, came to dominance. Monkey Khan was confirmed as Great Khan in 1251. His brothers Kublai and Hulegu would go on to reshape the empire's eastern and western halves respectively. Under Hulegu, the Mongol armies would reach Baghdad, a city that had been the seat of the Islamic Caliphate for 5 centuries, the cultural and spiritual heart of the Sunni Muslim world. That fall, in 1258, would be another of the great tragedies of medieval history. But that too is a story for another night. Aired his forces one more time and led them south. By the middle of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. It would hold that distinction. No empire since not the British at their widest reach, not the Russian at their fullest extent, would match it for contiguous land territory under a single political authority. Roughly 24 million square kilometers. Something close to a quarter of all the land on Earth. And yet, almost as soon as it reached its greatest size, it began to divide. This was not entirely failure. It was, in part, the inevitable consequence of scale. No single administrative system in the 13th century could govern territory stretching from Korea to Hungary. Communication alone, carrying a message from one end of the empire to the other, took months. Even with the extraordinary yam relay system of horse stations that the Mongols had built across their roads, fresh horses waiting every 20 miles, allowing messages to travel at speeds that astonished everyone who encountered the system. The empire divided into 4 great successor states, known as the Khanates. In the east, the Yuan dynasty, founded by Kublai Khan, ruled China and Mongolia. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate controlled the old Silk Road heartland. In Persia and the Middle East, the Ilkhanate, founded by Hulagu, governed a territory stretching from Anatolia to Afghanistan. And across the western steppe and into Russia, the Golden Horde, founded by Batu, grandson of Genghis, held sway over the Rus principalities and the lands of the old Cuman steppe. These Khanates were not always at peace with one another. They fought, negotiated, traded, and occasionally made war across their shared borders. But they shared a common origin, a common legal tradition in the Yasa, and for several generations, a common sense of belonging to something that had once been singular and magnificent. The Yuan dynasty in China lasted nearly a century. Kublai Khan, who completed the conquest of southern China from the Song dynasty in 1279 and declared himself Emperor of China, as well as Great Khan, was in many ways his grandfather's most complex inheritor. He was born into the steppe world, but came of age in the Chinese court. He spoke Mongolian, but governed in Chinese administrative structures. He patronized Buddhism, while maintaining the traditional Mongol tolerance for all religions. He built a new capital, Khanbalik, the city of the Khan, on the site of what is now Beijing, with a grandeur that stunned visitors. One of those visitors was a young Venetian merchant named Marco Polo, who arrived at Kublai's court in the 1270s and spent 17 years in his service. The account he brought back to Europe, dictated from memory in a Genoese prison, of all places described a world so wealthy, so sophisticated, so far beyond European experience that most of his contemporaries simply did not believe him. He described paper money, a postal relay system of extraordinary efficiency, cities of a size that dwarfed anything in Europe, a ruler who commanded more wealth than all the kings of Christendom combined. He was, by most modern assessments, telling the truth. The Khanates transformed as they aged. The Ilkhanate in Persia converted to Islam within a generation of its founding. The Mongol rulers, who had sacked Baghdad and ended the caliphate, became, in time, patrons of Islamic scholarship and art. The great historian Rashid al-Din, who wrote the most comprehensive account of Mongol history that survives, did so under Ilkhanate patronage. The conquerors became, in their own way, continuers of what they had destroyed. The Golden Horde in Russia converted to Islam as well, and its relationship with the Rus principalities it ruled shaped Russian political culture in ways that historians still debate. The long Mongol shadow over Russian statehood, taxation, and governance visible, some argue, for centuries afterward. The Chagatai Khanate became, over time, a largely Turkic and Muslim polity. The steppe culture of its founders absorbed into the oldest sedentary cultures of Central Asia. And the Yuan dynasty in China fell in 1368, driven out by a Chinese peasant uprising that established the Ming dynasty, a dynasty that, not coincidentally, made the deliberate rejection of foreign influence and the restoration of Chinese cultural purity central to its identity. One figure stands at the hinge between the Mongol Empire and its aftermath, and deserves a moment even in this final, drowsy telling. His name was Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane. Born in 1336 in the Chagatai Khanate, he was not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. He married into the lineage and ruled always as a regent rather than a Khan in his own right, because only the blood of Genghis could hold that title in the eyes of the steppe world. He spent his life conquering an empire that stretched from Turkey to India, deliberately invoking the memory and methods of Genghis Khan, and demonstrating with terrifying efficiency that the military techniques of the Mongols had not been forgotten. He was also a patron of extraordinary art and architecture. His capital at Samarkand, the same Samarkand that Genghis had shattered, he rebuilt into one of the most beautiful cities in the medieval world. The Registan, the Bibikhana Mosque, the Gar-e-Amir Mausoleum, where he himself is buried, beneath a slab of the darkest jade. The relationship between destruction and creation that runs through all of Mongol history reaches something like its fullest expression in Timur, a man who could order a tower of human skulls built outside a conquered city, and then commission a building of such delicate beauty that it still stops the breath of visitors 8 centuries later. This is not a comfortable paradox, but it may be an honest one. What did the Mongol Empire leave behind? The question has occupied historians for as long as there have been historians to ask it, and the answers are genuinely complicated. The destruction was real and vast. The loss of life across the campaigns in China, Central Asia, Persia, and Russia amounted to tens of millions of people. Precise figures are impossible, but the demographic collapse in some regions is visible in the archaeological and documentary record for generations afterward. The irrigation systems of Mesopotamia and Central Asia, some of them thousands of years old, were damaged in ways that altered the agricultural capacity of entire regions permanently. Libraries were burned. Languages died. Lineages of scholarship and craft were simply ended. And yet, the century after the Great Conquest, sometimes called the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace saw a period of unprecedented connectivity across the Eurasian landmass. The Great Silk Road trade routes, which the Mongol Empire now controlled end to end, became safer and more active than they had ever been. Goods moved from China to the Mediterranean with a reliability that had not existed before. Ideas moved with the mathematical concepts, agricultural techniques, artistic styles, medical knowledge. The bubonic plague also moved along those roads, reaching Europe in the 1340s and killing perhaps a third of its population. Connectivity carries everything, the beneficial and the catastrophic alike. Technologies transferred westward that would reshape European civilization, gunpowder and printing among them, both of Chinese origin, both carried along the Mongol roads. The astronomical observations made at the Great Observatory at Moraga, under Ilkhanate patronage, influenced Islamic and eventually European astronomy in ways that fed, ultimately, into the Copernican revolution. Marco Polo's account of Kublai's China inspired, among others, a young Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, who carried a heavily annotated copy of it on his voyages and was, in part, looking for the China that Marco Polo had described when he found something else entirely. The world that emerged from the Mongol century was not the world that had existed before it. Whether it was better or worse is a question that admits no clean answer. It was different, irreversibly, profoundly, in some ways permanently different. We come back, at the end, to the steppe. It is still there. The grass still moves in the wind. The sky is still as large as it has always been, that deep, aching blue that gave the Mongols their name for heaven. The horses still run across it, though fewer now, and the white circles of zhuz still appear in the valleys when the season is right. Mongolia today is a nation of roughly 3 million people, a small country by most measures, landlocked between Russia and China, with a capital city of glass towers and traffic jams, and also, on its outskirts, a ring of GER districts where the old way of life persists in adapted form. In the center of the capital, Ulaanbaatar, there is a great square. And at one end of that square, there is a statue. He sits on a horse, as he always Saturday. His face is broad and calm. His hands rest on the reins with the ease of a man who has been riding since before he could walk. He looks out across the square, across the city, across the steppe beyond it, across the centuries with an expression that is difficult to read. Not triumphant, exactly, Not peaceful either. Simply present. Simply here. The way he always was, by all accounts. Entirely, formidably present. This is where the story ends. Not with a battle or proclamation or death, but with a man on a horse, looking out at a sky that goes on forever. He was born in a felt tent. He died in a campaign, far from home, and was buried in an unmarked place in the grass, so that the land itself would be his monument. In between, he remade the world. What he was: hero, monster, visionary, destroyer, builder, breaker, is a question each person must answer for themselves, with the full complexity that the question deserves. History rarely gives us figures who are only one thing. The largest ones are always many things at once. What is certain is that he was here, that he lived and struggled and built and destroyed and loved his wife and feared the sky and never forgot a kindness or wound. That he was, for all the vastness of what surrounded him, a human being. Let that be the last thought, if you like. Not the empire, not the battles, not the maps covered in the reach of conquest. Just a person, born under a large sky, into a hard world, doing what they could with what they had. As all of us do. As all of us are doing, right now, in our own small and significant ways. Let your breathing be slow. Let the grass move in its wind somewhere at the edge of your awareness, soft and ceaseless and utterly peaceful. Let the sky be as big as it wants to be. And sleep. This concludes the video. Thanks for watching. Sleep well. Good night.